The following narratives represent an attempt to share information that will hopefully shed some light on some of the degradation, pain, and sufferings Yahweh's people have endured because of his promise to Abraham, as he says, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them 400 years. And since the Bible emphatically states, if you disobey Yahweh, then Yahweh will send you back into Egypt again in ships. The three-point thrust of these narratives is to take the pains and sufferings through first their captivity, second their forced transport in ships into slavery, and third their struggle in slavery and hopes for the future. So please come with me on this 30-minute spiritual journey and experience the physical and spiritual pains and brokenness of Yahweh's disobedient people. The following narratives were taken from historical and autobiographical documents, and as such they represent the gospel truth. They are presented to you in hope of challenging your understanding about the horrors of slavery. Please take the time to listen to the entire recording in one session if possible, so its full impact can register on your mind and emotions. Thank you. How many souls did Africa contribute to the Atlantic slave trade? Many scholars claim that Africa contributed upwards to 100 million souls to this evil trade. Out of this 100 million, 10 million would survive the trip to the west, and another 10 million would survive the trip to the east. The fare for the 20 millions who survived the passage on the slave ship was paid by 80 million others with their lives to tribal warfare, disease, suicide, and torture and murder by the white man. How many died on the slave ship? Who knows? Scholars, however, advise us that so many died that sharks would follow the ships from coast to coast. How many died? Too many. There was a man who stole a continent, being cruel as well as greedy and possessing power. He enslaved 20 million of its people, sending them over the ocean, 10 million to the eastern hemisphere, 10 million to the western hemisphere. In the process of capturing the 20 million people whom he sold, 80 million other people died, some during the slave raids. For when a village was raided, often the very young, the very old, and the sick were killed, some from exposure, disease, and grief during shipment abroad, and some by suicide at the water's edge or in transit. The sale of 20 million human beings as slaves gave the man hundreds of millions of treasure, but this was only the start of his enrichment. He and his children and grandchildren and those to whom he sold slaves received much, much more, many billions more, through the unpaid labor of whole generations of slaves. The morality of the man who stole a continent and his children and grandchildren and agents can only be characterized as the most way-out evil this world has ever known. And way-out evil is satanic and has only one possible end: to be cast out altogether and forever from the society known as humankind, to be cast into the burning fire, which is its natural home, to be remembered only by the generations which follow its end as the most devastating catastrophe that ever befell mankind. In 1441, Captain Goncalves, in charge of a Portuguese ship off the west coast of Africa on its return trip home, decided with the support of his crew to bring the first of the captives back home. They went ashore and caught a man walking with his camel. He fought and was overwhelmed and shackled. Returning to their ship, they saw a black woman and captured her also. Another Portuguese ship was in the area seeking captives, and consequently they joined forces and sent a party of 10 men each ashore to attack and return with captives. Their first target was a village of sleeping inhabitants. In the confusion, many Africans defended themselves, but after the smoke cleared, the Portuguese had killed 4 men and captured 10 men, women, and boys. This victory thrilled Prince Henry. He took action by sending an ambassador of his to the Pope to advise him of his intent to raid the west coast of Africa and possibly conquer Africa itself. He promised the Pope to Christianize the Africans. The Pope blessed the venture and promised complete forgiveness for all who participated in that war. One of the African captives was the chief's son and promised to replace himself and 2 others if returned home with 10 people. This happened, and the Portuguese people realized how easy and profitable it was to capture Africans, and immediately raised enough money to outfit 6 ships and wage a small-scale war against the people on the west coast of Africa. The casualty count, 165 men, women, and children were taken captive. The next attack on the people of the west coast of Africa sucked 235 from Africa and shipped them as captives back to Portugal. Approximately 50 years later, as the last great African empire collapsed, leaving the West African people defenseless, the Portuguese built El Mina Castle off of the Guinea coast. In 1482, European ships appeared off of the modern-day coast of Ghana. Then in 1492, Christopher Columbus set out to find a new world to capture and colonize. He captured and brought in his devastating wake the extermination of 12 to 25 millions of the original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands. After the depletion of the original inhabitants, Father Bartolomé de las Casas and Christopher Columbus decided to import Africans to replace their original inhabitants as he exploited. Father de las Casas implored Charles V to send more Africans and replace the indigenous people. Charles V agreed and gave a courtier of his the right to ship 4,000 Africans across the seas. For 100 years, the Portuguese controlled the flow of the trade in human beings. They did all they could to keep others out. But eventually, the Dutch, Englishmen, Frenchmen, the Danes, Swedes, and Prussians all entered the war for captive Africans. In 1700, England took the lead in the unjust, nefarious war and capturing of African people. The economies of Europe began to flourish. In Liverpool, England, the entire economy hinged on slavery. Many shops sold paraphernalia associated with animals and slaves. For instance, one shop carried silver neck collars and chains for dogs and captured Africans. In 1619, African captives arrived at Jamestown in the United States. By now, all of Europe and America was deeply involved in the wars in Africa and the profits that came from selling Africans, shipping them abroad and exploiting their labor until they died. The profit from these wars financed the rise of capitalism. On one of the forced marches of the captive Africans from the interior to the west coast, one of the captives had been finding it hard to keep going the last 3 days. As they entered the town, it was evident he could go no further, and his master resolved to trade him for a young girl belonging to one of the townspeople. Early in the morning, the girl came out with some other young women to see the caravan off. She had no idea of her fate until her master took her by the hand and delivered her to her new owner. Her gay expression changed. Terror and distress took hold of her as a load was put on her head and a rope placed around her neck. It was pitiful to hear her wild farewell to her friends, but the captives took it as a matter of course. A disabled captive had been left behind, and another captive had taken his place.